Barely a decade after the Wright brothers' first powered flight, the world saw the birth of a terrifying new weapon. It was a weapon that was destined to change the nature of battle forever. The aeroplane went to war. In the course of the 20th century, aeroplanes have added a new and menacing dimension to warfare. Technical progress has been swift. Little more than a lifetime separates the era of wood, wire, and linen from this potent fighting machine, the Tornado. Today they fly at supersonic speeds, but their purpose remains the same as their forebears 80 years ago, to destroy the enemy. The Wright brothers saw the potential of their aeroplane as a platform for military observation. The first people they tried to sell it to were the armies of the United States, France, and Great Britain. At that time, though, the military were not sure what to make of this new and curious contraption. But soon they began to see its potential for reconnaissance. The box kite was one of the first aircraft ordered by Britain's fledgling Air Force, the Royal Flying Corps.
When I first joined the Flying Corps, there were really no fighting machines as such in existence. In fact, in our squadron, when it was being formed, they were nearly all machines that had been requisitioned from either private owners or civilian flying schools. In those days, the Flying Corps was extremely small. Nearly all the pilots were officers from army regiments who'd ridden horses, had money, and thought it'd be a good idea to go in for a new branch of science, like flying. And so there were very few other ranks who had any chance of getting flying training.
One was asked when one wanted to join the Flying Corps if you rode a horse. And if you hunted, they were delighted because they thought you got the feeling in your hand would help you to fly. The only trouble was I was overweight. You had to be under 10 stone 7, and I was about 5 pounds over that. And I had to get it off very quickly. So the only thing I could think of was to box with my fellow cadets as much as possible, drink as much castor oil as I could manage, and eat nothing. Well, I had 24 hours to do it, and when I was weighed, I was 1 pound underweight. And that's how I started life in the Flying Corps.
At the outbreak of the First World War, commanders were presented with a bewildering array of new weapons: long-range artillery, machine guns, and the aeroplane. The only role they thought suitable for this new machine was reconnaissance, observing enemy troop movements and spotting for artillery. But if the generals were slow to appreciate the aeroplane, many of the troops caught up in the hell of the trenches were not.
There was nothing good in the trenches. You can just imagine the stench of rotting humans. There were rats all over the place eating dead bodies. And if you could get into something that got you away from it, well, that was heaven. And, of course, the Air Force was definitely the thing you thought of because you could see them in the air. Just flying there, they always looked so safe and comfortable.
In 1914, the air forces of the major powers were tiny. The British went to war with only 63 aircraft, but they soon proved their value. By the end of the war, 2/3 of all military intelligence was found or confirmed by aircraft. In the early days, the means of communication was primitive.
Right, we better get this back to HQ as soon as possible.
For the early naval pilots like Wolfram Eisenhower, getting information back quickly was even harder.
Wenn es eine wichtige und eilige Nachricht war.
If the news was important or urgent, we carried messenger pigeons with us on board, as we had no radio at that time. We wrote our report on a small piece of paper. This was put into a metal tube that was fastened with a clip onto the foot of the pigeon. Then the pigeon was thrown out, and usually they arrived safely.
Die allermeisten an.
By 1915, aerial reconnaissance had a new tool, the camera. Photographs of the front were rushed back and minutely analyzed. They provided valuable information to the army commanders. Throughout the war, reconnaissance remained the most important task of air forces on both sides. Weather permitting, almost every day, somewhere over the front, pilots would be photographing what the enemy was up to. It was becoming impossible to keep secrets. So both sides set out to stop it. The first response was from the ground, with anti-aircraft guns. But soon the pilots began to arm themselves. Thus, aerial combat was born.
We started off, when I first went to France, with just an ordinary rifle for the observer, and pilots very often had a pistol. Hard enough to hit anything with a machine gun, let alone with a rifle and a pistol. It was pure luck, really, whether you hit anything or not.
It was a very clean, nice war. We used to return any luggage or baggage when we shot out a German. Used to fly over and take his stuff back to drop in a German aerodrome. And they did the same for us. But later on in the war, things changed a bit, I think. Became rather less gentlemanly.
In the early months of the war, the French led the way in military aviation. Their air force was rapidly expanding, and they were the first to fit a machine gun onto an aeroplane. They put it on the top wing, but it was a clumsy affair and difficult to operate. What the pilot wanted was a fixed gun that fired forward, so that they could aim the whole plane at the target. Roland Garros came up with a solution.
Garros, a Frenchman, fitted up a deflector behind his propeller so that he could fire straight ahead. He used this on the Germans and shot down 4 or 5 of these Germans in fairly quick order. This put the Germans in a great state of dismay. And they turned to Fokker and they said, "You must give us something that we can fire through the propeller."
Anthony Fokker and his engineers quickly came up with an improved system, the interrupter gear. It synchronized the firing of the machine gun with the propeller so that the bullets passed safely through its spinning arc. As important, they built a new aeroplane to exploit the invention, the Fokker Eindecker. At last, the Germans had a purpose-built fighting machine. The whole plane had become a weapon. Its advantages soon became apparent and Allied losses rose dramatically. The period became known as the Fokker Scourge.
The Fokker Scourge arrived about the end of 1915, but it was really horrible, because this wonderful Fokker firing through the propeller was something completely new to us, and it did a lot of damage, shot down a lot of our machines.
The speed was faster than anything we had got. So much so that I found myself writing home to my parents to try and reassure them on the subject by telling them the exact opposite. I wrote and said the Fokker was not a menace at all, which was a lie.
With the formidable Fokker, the Germans were winning the air battle. They pioneered many of the principles of air combat, devised new tactics and formed specialized fighter squadrons. Architect of their success was Oswald Bölker, an ace who was soon to have 40 victories to his credit. His friend Max Immelmann was another ace who gave his name to a spectacular air combat maneuver. In the dogfights over the Western Front, the Germans demonstrated Bölker's tactics with great success. Attack whenever possible from out of the sun. Seek an advantage before engaging the enemy. Get behind and close before firing. If the enemy dives to attack, turn and face him. Don't fly away. Without the interrupter gear, the Allies tried a different route. They put the propeller at the back and the gunner at the front. These pushers gave them a breathing space, but what was needed was a thoroughbred fighter. In December 1916, they finally got one. The Sopwith Pup was one of the first British fighters with a synchronized machine gun firing through the propeller. It was fast, extremely maneuverable, and adored by its pilots. In the 2 years since the war had started, aeroplane design had improved dramatically. Pilots were now at the controls of high-performance killing machines. In 1916, the Allies had a majority of almost 2-to-1 in aircraft, and the German industrial machine was at full stretch to try and keep up. It was a period of rapid technological change. The balance of advantage was constantly shifting from one side to the other as new aircraft were introduced. Fighter pilots always wanted more speed. To give it to them, designers built more powerful engines. Higher speeds in aerial combat meant higher stresses on the new fighter plane. In the war at sea, both sides had been exploring what use they could make of the aeroplane. In 1916, the Germans demonstrated how vulnerable ships were when they sank a Russian destroyer.
Das erste Flugzeug war auf jeden dieser beiden Zerstörer.
The first plane dropped 4 bombs on each of these 2 destroyers, but both times they fell short and missed. So I learned this lesson and dropped all 8 bombs on 1 destroyer. The 5th actually hit, and the ship was damaged, so that it sank.
But finding the enemy's ships in the big ocean has never been easy. And the Royal Navy had realized the usefulness of the aeroplane for reconnaissance. they also saw its advantages in helping to range the ship's big guns. The problem was aircraft could only operate from land. So experiments were made to see if they could take off from a platform on the ship's guns.
In those days, it was very difficult to get a machine safely off the turrets of a battleship because the Navy didn't understand it really. They didn't know what to do, and you had to have the wind blowing directly down the turret platform, because if you didn't get it blowing down the platform, you just rolled off to the side. The other difficulty about it was that we never had speed when we got to the end of the gun platform, and so we dropped off into the sea. But we picked up before we reached the sea. We had 40 feet.
Launching an aeroplane from a gun turret was one thing. Getting it back to the ship was quite another. Finally, the Navy adapted HMS Furious, a battle cruiser, by building a special deck at the bow of the ship as a runway for the aircraft. But there still remained the problem of where to land.
We'd fly off the Furious, but at the end of the sortie, we had no alternative but to ditch our aircraft in the sea. You landed a bit high over the waves. The nose would pitch in, and then would settle back into the angle of about 45 degrees, and then you'd hop up and sit on the tail. The destroyer would come up alongside you, and on a calm day, you'd put your foot in the rope fall and you'd be hoisted up and you might not even get wet. Because other days when it was much more stormy, you might get very wet indeed. And we didn't bother about the aircraft that went to the bottom of the sea. The pilot was the important thing. Quite right, too.
After all, the aeroplane cost no more than a 16-inch shell, but it was a dangerous business. So the Navy decided to hold trials to see whether or not a plane could land on the short deck on the bow of HMS Furious.
The first pilot to land on the 2nd of August 1917 was my CO, Squadron Commander Dunning. And there were little rope toggles, one on each wingtip, and our job to run under the aircraft, seize the rope toggle, and then the pilot would cut his engine and we'd haul it down. There was a terrific sort of stir when this first successful landing happened. It really was an historic event. 6 days later, Dunning was to do another landing, and this time he came in a little too high. He waved to us to get clear. He was going to go round again. He opened his engine up and choked it a little. The aircraft stalled and cartwheeled over the side. And really, by sheer misfortune, he actually was drowned.
Dunning, though, had proved that the concept could work. In 1918, the Royal Navy took delivery of HMS Argus. The age of the aircraft carrier had dawned. But landing on a pitching deck has never been easy. On the Western Front, the aircraft lined up against each other could now be counted in their hundreds. But the strategies of the two sides were different. The Allies adopted a relentless offensive policy, always patrolling over the enemy lines. Its architect was the commander of the Royal Flying Corps, General Hugh Trenchard. It was a costly policy in pilots' lives. In 1916, the average life expectancy of a pilot on the Western Front was 3 weeks. By April 1917, it was just 2. The Germans were winning the air battle.
I suppose the worst time that the Flying Corps has ever had in its history was in bloody April, when our casualties were quite serious.
There were a lot of new boys going out and had to be thrown in at the deep end straight away because they just hadn't got pilots. They went very often with only 15 or 16 hours solo.
In 6 weeks, in the spring of 1917, the Royal Flying Corps lost 20% of its pilots. The horrendous losses meant that new pilots had to be trained quickly. In Britain, the training was often hurried, and in the early days, not always appropriate. What the pilots needed was to learn the principles of air combat. It wasn't until August 1917, when a new and rigorous system of flying and combat training was introduced, that the situation improved.
In the earliest days of instruction, the pupils did break a lot of aircraft, so we called them Huns. They broke more aircraft than the Germans were doing. It was just a joke.
Once the pupils had learned how to fly, they were sent off for a gunnery course. There they learned the art of deflection shooting on some ingenious contraptions.
To be a good fighter pilot, you had to shoot straight, be full of guts, of course, and have wonderful eyes. And the trouble was there's so many wonderfully fine pilots on our side who had born bad shots. And they have every other attribute which have made them a good pilot, but they couldn't shoot straight.
With the Allied policy of offensive patrolling, there was little respite for the new pilot when he reached the front. If he was lucky, he'd be flying the new SE-5.
The SE-5 was a nice, stable aircraft to fly. It produced a splendid gun platform. It could dive as fast as the Germans could dive, and we were on definitely equal terms.
Nobody ever liked the dawn patrol. We were woken up about 3, and you felt perfectly awful. Had to creep out of bed and try to eat breakfast. An awful liver on you, kind of fed up with everything. But once you got in the air, things were much better.
Most of our patrols were done to about 10,000 feet or so, and you had to have your face or any exposed part of your body smothered in whale oil, which smelled rather horrible. But if you didn't, you'd get frostbitten, and that was a court-martial offense.
Usually we were up before the Germans, I think. We probably got up about half an hour earlier, because they seemed to appear later.
The patrol would be on the lookout for German reconnaissance planes like the LVG, which was slow but heavily armed.
Personally, I would always wish to attack from above. Height gave you speed. You could dive and maneuver, fast turns and so on, and the other fellow couldn't attack you.
The gun was on top of the wing, and you had a ratchet which you could pull it down in front of your face to reload and then push it up again. But Ball, who I knew quite well, he used to keep it down, get underneath the machine and just spray the underside with bullets from about 15 yards range. The Germans weren't able to do anything because he was invisible, and he brought down quite a lot of machines in that way.
April 1917. The United States declares war on Germany and threatens to darken the skies of Europe with planes. Yet before the war, America only had 24 combat-ready pilots and a handful of military aeroplanes. Soon, though, aircraft were rolling off the production lines in their thousands.
America's airplane factories and us war workers didn't get started until late. To make airplane wings, they took us house carpenters, furniture upholsterers, even seamstresses with high pompadours. Meet Rosie the Riveter, 1917. Painters used varnish that smelled like bananas. The fuselage, which we finally chose, was of British design. The engine was all American. Its manufacture was the outstanding production achievement of the war. In all, 4,500 DH-4 airplanes powered by the Liberty engine were put together in this country.
A massive recruitment campaign was launched for pilots to fly these planes. By the end of the war, more than 10,000 American pilots had been trained, many by the British and the French. Some American pilots were already fighting in Europe. They had joined a special French squadron known as the Escadrille Lafayette, and they passed on their combat experience to their countrymen. The American pilots had their first successes in April 1918. By Armistice Day in November that year, they had shot down 850 Germans. New aces were coming to public attention, men like Raoul Lufbery and Eddie Rickenbacker, who was to finish the war with 26 kills. A lot of aces liked to paint their aircraft in gaudy colors. In a war where hundreds of thousands of men died anonymously on the ground, a few became national heroes for their exploits in the air. By far the most successful ace of the war, though, was Baron Manfred von Richthofen. A national hero, winner of Germany's highest award, pour le mérite, he commanded an elite mobile fighter squadron. It was nicknamed by the Allies the Flying Circus.
He was a really friendly person and laughed a lot. Then, of course, he was also very handsome. He was somewhat stocky and cut a dashing figure. Richthofen was, of course, famous because of his great number of kills. For us as young pilots, it was a tremendous incentive to always do what he suggested and what he demanded. We talked about him, and slowly he became something of an idol.
One aircraft, more than any other, became part of the Richthofen legend, the Fokker triplane. Painted red, highly maneuverable, it struck fear into the hearts of Allied pilots. It was in his Dreidecker that he shot down his 80th victim, making him the most successful ace of the war on either side.
Richthofen was a man without nerves. Otherwise, he could not have done what he did. We were frightened, I admit it. And he said, "What are you waiting for then? It's very easy. Get on with it and shoot." But for us, this was very hard. His great tactic was that because of his good eyesight, he recognized the enemy in plenty of time. Then he could work out exactly how to fly in order to achieve surprise. Naturally, straight out of the sun.
Richthofen was a magnificent leader of men, and he had this circus, probably up to 40, 50 machines, and he'd stooge up and down 10 miles each side of the line, watching for one of our chaps, and then he'd come and have a scrap.
By 1918, the aeroplane had come of age as a fighting machine, and enormous dogfights unfolded above the trenches. The battle was for command of the skies.
When we got into a scrap, it was really every man for himself.
Things were wild, and it was a question of dog eat dog. You got him or he got you.
It was exciting. It was always exciting. It was fast.
At 21 years old, there's no such thing really as fear. You get so excited with what you're doing that it's more like being in a football game than it is being in a fight.
The first one I shot down, it burst from the air. The whole thing went into smithereens. And I was very, very sick. I was awful. Of course I was scared. You were yelling at the top of your lungs, and if you weren't, you were very determinedly trying to get your enemy before he got you.
We knew the odds that we were playing for, our lives. We knew we had to be very alert, very electric.
In the seesawing air battles, aces were made and as swiftly destroyed. Not even the great Richthofen escaped. There is still argument about who shot him down. A Canadian pilot, Roy Brown, was firing at him when he crashed, but so was some Australian infantry. Soldiers stripped his famous triplane for souvenirs. But such was the legend of the man. The Allies gave him a funeral with full military honors.
Am 21. April 1918.
On the 21st of April 1918, the terrible news reached the whole front. Richthofen is dead. We couldn't believe it. How was it possible for Richthofen to be shot down, a man who flew in such a superb way?
On November the 11th, 1918, the war ended. In its 4 terrible years, the air forces had changed out of all recognition. The British now had the first independent air force in the world, the Royal Air Force. It was also the biggest, with 22,500 aircraft in 200 squadrons. But the cost had been high. Britain alone had lost nearly 9,500 pilots during the 4-year war. The aeroplanes themselves had changed dramatically during the war. At the beginning, they could barely reach 10,000 feet and were extremely slow. By the war's end, aircraft like the Bristol fighter could climb to 20,000 feet and fly at over 120 miles an hour. Fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed, the Bristol fighter embodied all the technical progress of 4 years of war. But with the fighting over, what jobs were there for these thoroughbreds of the skies? In 1920, Trenchard, now the Royal Air Force's new chief, found a role for his young service in helping to police the British Empire. A revolutionary tribal leader in Somaliland, known as the Mad Mullah, had established himself firmly in the country and now began to harass British troops. Trenchard seized the opportunity to demonstrate the advantages of air power.
The Mad Mullah, who had been thorn in our side for years past, he was a nuisance again. Well, the army would have required 2 divisions to go in and do it. Government couldn't afford it. So the Secretary of State asked Trenchard, can you help us to reduce the cost? Trenchard used 1 squadron. Its simple instructions given to it were, bomb them all out of the forts and shoot them up on the ground. The war lasted 6 weeks, at the end of which the Mullah was dead, his followers were scattered all over the place, and the Secretary of State and the House of Commons said it was the cheapest war in the history of warfare.
For the next 10 years, most countries cut back on defense spending. Consequently, advances in the design of military aircraft were slow.
Okay.
The Hawker Hind was in service with the RAF in the 1930s, but its design still owed much to its First World War predecessors. Open cockpit, pilot in front, and observer with machine gun behind. The Hind was sturdy and reliable, but the toughest enemy it had to face were Afghan tribesmen on the northwest frontier.
The RAF's job on the northwest frontier was to keep the peace amongst the tribesmen who lived up in the northwest frontier province on the edge of Afghanistan. They were farmers, and they were really rather enjoyed war more or less as a hobby. They nearly all were armed, all the men were armed, and from time to time they would take some kind of offensive action either against each other or against the police post, and then we would be required to do something about it. Our main job, of course, is the bombing. And if the tribesmen down below misbehaved, which meant that they'd either shot someone or they'd stolen something, we would go out, first of all, dropping leaflets to indicate to them what we were going to do and the reason for it. That would, with luck, bring them to heel. If not, you knock down one of the villages.
The leaflets gave the tribesmen 48 hours' notice to evacuate their village.
The danger, from our point of view, was engine failure. If you bailed out in your parachute, then of course you were likely to find a lot of extremely angry tribesmen down the bottom who were not going to welcome you with open arms. They might hand you over to the women of the tribe who would do some extremely nasty things to you. We carried what was called a protection certificate. That promised enormous sums of money if they would bring you in, and there was a sort of graded thing that if they brought you in alive and complete, then they got more money than if they brought you in dead or suffering, shall we say, from sudden surgery.
Aeroplanes were a cheap and effective way of policing the British Empire. But across the Atlantic, the struggle was going on to get recognition for air power as a distinct form of waging war. Its champion was General Billy Mitchell, a flamboyant veteran from the First World War. To prove how effective air power could be, he laid on a number of bombing demonstrations. The targets would be some captured German warships.
For the tests, Billy Mitchell hastily assembled a force including some Navy flyers which he trained at Langley Field, Virginia. He taught them the same bombing techniques which he had learned in World War I. Engines were started, and the 1st Provisional Air Brigade took off for a mission which was to test the future of military aviation.
In a series of demonstrations, each one on a bigger ship and each one with bigger bombs, Mitchell and his team rubbed home the point in front of a skeptical Navy. They sank a U-boat, a destroyer, a light cruiser, and then, most spectacularly of all, a battleship, the Ostfriesland, with its 4-layered armored hull.
Billy Mitchell was so fully sold on the use of aircraft in war that he became unpopular both with the infantry people and with the naval people. He was convinced that the next war would be fought chiefly in the air. And he was pretty nearly right. I think that's the best way to describe Billy Mitchell. He was ahead of his time, let's put it that way.
He was trying to prove that the Air Force was becoming an Air Force as such. And I think he very definitely did. But the Navy didn't like it, and there were some old, shall I say, fuddy-duddies who decided that they would court-martial him, which they proceeded to do. It was totally unfair, but that's what happened.
Mitchell's outspoken championing of an independent Air Force led inevitably to a showdown with the military establishment. He was court-martialed for breach of military discipline and forced to retire. But even as a civilian, he went on arguing the case for air power.
There are and have been those in the United States who should be court-martialed for their deliberate suppression of our air power. Today, air power is the first line of defense of every country in the world. Without air power, the nation is lost.
Mitchell died in obscurity in 1936, the year that revealed how prophetic he'd been. For as Europe prepared for war again, a new breed of fighter was born. Streamlined and powerful, these fighter planes were to confront each other in 1940 in a deadly duel for air superiority in the skies over southern England. They were to take part in the first all-air battle in history, the Battle of Britain. There was the Spitfire, perhaps the most glamorous of all the Second World War fighters. It was armed with 8 machine guns. It could fly at over 400 miles an hour. The Hurricane was the RAF's other main fighter. It may not have had the speed and glamour of the Spitfire, but it was to bear the brunt of the fighting in the Battle of Britain. The German counterpart was the Messerschmitt 109. Fast and well-armed, it had already proved its worth in the German blitzkrieg across Europe. Now it was being made ready for its stiffest challenge to date, to prepare the way for the invasion of Britain.
It was the most modern fighter plane that there was in the whole world. First of all, it was a low-winged plane. Secondly, it had an enclosed cockpit. And thirdly, it was equipped with a retractable undercarriage. It was even as good as the first Spitfire, even a little better. And so everyone had the feeling, I am completely safe when formation flying.
The invasion could only succeed if the German Air Force won control of the skies. The Luftwaffe held the key to victory. Bombers spearheaded the attack. Slow and vulnerable, they had to rely on formations of fighters to protect them. The Germans started by bombing British shipping in the Channel, then moved against the radar installations, attacked the airfields, and finally turned on the cities.
Our main object was to get in quickly to shoot a bomber down before their 109s attacked us. The Luftwaffe escorting fighters were very good, and you didn't have much time to make your bomber kill. But our main objective always to get them on the way to target, to try and turn the raid away or inflict damage on the bombers. Is not generally appreciated is that if you did keep your finger on the button, your ammunition would expend itself in 14 seconds. You've got about 6 2-second bursts. And so I didn't start firing until I was very close. A lot of our tactics we had to pick up from the Germans as we went along. Initially, we had to fly with collars and ties and button coats and everything. You'd be surprised. And it was very hot, amongst other things. But gradually, we undid our collars for one very good reason, that we could turn our necks round and look behind us. We learnt to weave. Instead of flying into tight formation, we learnt to weave from the Germans again. The great memory I have is being very tired. We were on readiness from 3:30 in the morning till 10:30 at night. On a bad day, we'd do 5 or 6 sorties against the enemy. We never had enough pilots. We had pilots, but they weren't trained. They only had flown, say, 8 hours on a Hurricane when they came to the squadron, which is like the average youngster today getting in his sports car and not knowing where the gear lever is.
Blue section only.
The RAF pilots were a cosmopolitan bunch, mainly British and Empire. They were reinforced by Czechs, Poles, and French. much less experienced than the Germans, but they had the vital advantage of operating over their own territory. Radar gave them warning of enemy attacks and allowed them to scramble at the right moment without having to spend too long in the air or burn too much fuel. But the RAF's losses were heavy. In a 10-day period in August, 90 pilots were killed and 60 wounded. But the German casualties were greater still. By September the 17th, they'd lost over 1,200 aircraft.
The Messerschmitt was a better fighter in one way, that you had a cannon firing through the propeller, which there meant if you got very close, you could really inflict damage with a better weapon. The most important role in the dogfight was a steep turn. You could outmaneuver anything in the Hurricane. It was the most marvelous aeroplane for that. You lost a lot of friends. This is the awful part of it. You become colder. You don't become so warm a person because you're afraid to make friends because you're going to lose them. And if you flew long enough and often enough, you gradually saw more.
On September the 17th, Hitler called off the invasion. The Luftwaffe continued their attacks for many more months, but they had lost the battle. Air power, as Mitchell and Trenchard predicted, had saved a country.
The Battle of Britain, it completely exonerated Trenchard, because he said all along there would come a day when this country faced air power, and he was right. Because whatever else you like about the Battle of Britain, you've got to remember one thing. It is the only battle ever fought in the air without the Army and Navy which changed a whole war.